This is our second lesson in the book of Daniel. And as you can see here, we're starting with chapter 8 about a vision about a goat and a ram. The ram's horns were different lengths. That isn't really obvious in the picture here, but the longer one started growing after the shorter one. The ram was unstoppable in conquest, but then came the goat with a horn between its eyes, flying toward the ram with blinding speed, such that it didn't even touch the ground, and easily destroyed it. The goat, like the little horn we learned about in the first lesson, was very arrogant, but its power was short-lived, and the single horn was replaced with 4 others, pointing to the 4 compass points. That's what it means to say to the 4 winds. And then if we see down in verse 9 of chapter 8, a small horn grew up among them and aimed against the north, south, east, and Israel, the beautiful land. That's what the expression is used often in the scriptures for Israel. The same horn is then said to have reached to heaven and drawn away some of the stars, but it trampled them and then turned against the prince of the army of heaven, from whom the daily sacrifice was removed and the temple destroyed. And truth itself was also hurled to the ground. Now, taking 1/3 of the stars from heaven and hurling them to earth is mentioned in Revelation 12:4. But what can it mean that they're trampled? Some say the stars here must refer to the people of Israel, since they had the temple and the sacrifices, but others say that they represent the fallen angels. Yet why would Satan destroy his own angels? A possible answer for that would be that they had been defeated by heaven's armies according to Revelation 12:7, so Satan destroys them in a fit of rage for their failure. But though we really can't rule out either interpretation, the commentary considers it beyond dispute that it refers here to the people of Israel because of verse 12. So what we have here may be another type and shadow, the defeat of Israel foreshadowing the defeat of the fallen angels. This is often the case when it's unclear which thing is true. It may be both of them in some way. Now, for interpretations of the ram and goat, the ram seems to represent Medo-Persia, which was also portrayed as the bear and the silver part of the statue in earlier visions. So we've got 3 of these now. And it had pushed in those directions, that empire had, as it grew. The goat seems to represent Greece, especially its unprecedented conquest under the tactical geniuses of Alexander the Great. That is to say, the conquest it made against others, not against it. So this is probably Greece, especially Alexander the Great. This was portrayed in the earlier visions as the leopard and the bronze part of the statue. This all played out in history, more details of which we'll see later. Then Daniel hears someone ask the duration of this particular event, and their answer is that it will last 2,300 evenings and mornings, a familiar expression from Creation Week, and equivalent to either 6.5 or 3.5 years, depending on how you take the expression, because some will say 3,000 sets of evenings and mornings, or 2,300 rather, or that many sets of evenings and that many sets of mornings. So it depends on how you take that. Anyway, a fulfillment took place after the defeat of Antiochus Epiphanes in 165 BC and the subsequent rededication of the temple, which the Jewish feast of Hanukkah commemorates. So that is one possible fulfillment. Now in verse 16, we see that the angel Gabriel is sent to Daniel to explain the vision, which was for the time of the end. And then it's in verse 20 that we are told that the ram's 2 horns represent the kings of Media and Persia. The goat is Alexander, the king of Greece, after whose death 4 of his generals ruled, those being, if I cannot mangle their names too bad, Lysimachus, Cassander, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. You've probably heard about the Ptolemies in any kind of history of Egypt. We'll say more about them in chapter 11. But for now, the rash and deceitful king coming later was none other than the vile and treacherous Antiochus Epiphanes, who did not die in battle at the hands of men, but from an infestation of worms. But though he fulfilled this prophecy, which Daniel is told to seal in verse 26, he was surely a type and shadow, so we can use him as a clue about what to expect from the future beast or antichrist. In other words, once again, if you want to know what to expect in the future, look at how it was first fulfilled in the past. And that's what Jesus said about when he referred to Daniel, and what we can see now in hindsight is this has happened before in exactly this way, and it will happen again in exactly that way. And now we come to what is easily the most familiar and controversial passage in Bible prophecy, the 70 weeks. This is down to chapter 9. But as mentioned in the study of Jeremiah, Daniel understood from his writings, that is to say, Jeremiah's writings, that the 70-year captivity of Israel in Babylon was coming to an end. And you may want to look at the chart in the commentary on this chapter for where this captivity fits in the timeline of all the goings-on of that sort of thing in Israel's history. But pay attention to the fact that Daniel interpreted Jeremiah's prophecy literally, physically. So we shouldn't think that Daniel's prophecies aren't also to be taken literally, especially since history shows their literal physical fulfillment thus far. There's no reason to take just whatever is future as allegory. No reason at all. Daniel's response to this understanding was to go to God in prayer, confessing the sins of his people. Shouldn't we Christians do the same as we see the day approaching? Instead, many show either apathy or hostility to the study of prophecy. But Daniel prays for God's deliverance even though he already knows it's coming, because that's how true servants of God behave. Now, as we see down here in verse 20, the answer was already on its way via Gabriel while Daniel was praying, and Gabriel gives a short but massively important prophecy starting in verse 24. This is the famous 70 weeks prophecy, and it's packed with significant details. Because of those details, we know in hindsight that the weeks, or sevens, referred to groups of years, such that the 70 of them amount to a total of 490 years. And these are divided into 3 groups, but notice first of all the purpose and people involved. It's to your people and your holy city, speaking to Daniel, to end and atone for sin. Whose sin? Israel's in this context, to begin eternal righteousness, to seal up prophetic vision, and to anoint and dedicate the most holy place. Your people are Daniel's people, the Hebrews. Your city is Daniel's and the Hebrews' city, Jerusalem. The most holy place is the temple in Jerusalem. Eternal righteousness and sealing up prophecy refer to the end of all things in life as we've known it. So this is a very specific prophecy for the people and land of Israel, and only involves us as Christians insofar as it involves the righteous of all ages. And that's a vital part of the context. So now let's go down to verse 25, and here we're given a starting point. The command to restore and rebuild the literal physical city of Jerusalem. We know this because it happened in history that way. Various such commands are discussed in the commentary about which this could refer to in history, but one in particular gave permission to rebuild Jerusalem specifically, and the calculations include the key fact that prophetic years were of 360 days each rather than our modern 365. So, don't be afraid of the math, it's not very complicated. We count 69 times 7 is 483 prophetic years from the decree given in 444 BC, gives us 476 of our years. So we count to determine the year AD by subtracting the 444. That brings us to 32 AD for the end of the 69th. And that's the year Jesus was crucified or cut off. So it matches precisely if you know how to count the years and you know what decree to look for. So, Jesus was indeed crucified around 32 AD. But what about the 7 and 62 for that first 69 weeks? Why is it divided up that way? It depends on how one understands the ancient languages here and how it should be punctuated. You can check the link in the description for some painstaking detail about all that, and for widely different views on what the verse actually says. But we should be able to point to something that happened 7 times 7, or 49, years after the decree, and then count 62 times 7, or 434 years from there to Jesus' crucifixion. The part about it being built with a plaza and moat but in stressful times is the key. The rebuilding would begin first with the perimeter, which was huge according to research, and took some time, 49 years, and only completed after the end of that time that they had to build. That they had 49 years for all this to happen. The first sevens. And so this was happening in stages, and that's what we see in history. To say, as some do with meticulous arguments, that, as you will see in some of those links, that this prophecy cannot refer to Jesus is to say that there was no significance to phrases such as the fullness of time for Jesus to come, per Galatians 4:4. No reason for the people of Jesus' day to have been looking for their redemption, per Luke 2:38, and Jesus rebuked them for not knowing. And there would be no explanation for why someone named Simon at the temple had been told in Luke 2:26 that he wouldn't die until he had seen the Messiah. I'm more inclined to reject the Hebrew Masoretic text upon which the linguistic arguments are made against this being a messianic prophecy, especially since the Greek, the Septuagint, isn't nearly as ambiguous. The prophecy in Greek says something like this, as far as I can determine, though no two translations seem to agree, because it is a difficult passage in any language. But I'm just going to read the whole rest of this prophecy all at once in what I can see in the Greek version. Quote, "And you shall know and perceive from the giving of word to respond and rebuild Jerusalem until an anointed prince comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. The wall and square will be rebuilt in difficult times," or you could say when the time is exhausted or completed. And then verse 26, "After the 62 sevens, the anointed will be devastated for no valid reason," that is to say, without justice. "The coming leader will pollute the city and holy place, and they will be cut off as in a flood. Devastations will be ordered until war ends." Then verse 27, "He will enforce a covenant with many for 1 7. And halfway through it, sacrifices and offerings will be terminated. There will be a very defiling desecration upon the temple, and there will be desolation until the appointed time." That's how I see the whole passage in the Greek. Needless to say, this passage is very controversial, but the whole of Scripture must be considered in order to guide us when ancient wording is in so much dispute. In my opinion, a consistent approach to Bible interpretation both allows and demands that this be taken as messianic. And that all came from just verse 25. So now let's look at 26, and this thing scrolled too far on me again. It does that sometimes, which is about an anointed one being cut off, which we recall was also spoken of in similar terms in Isaiah 53 about being cut off, which is clearly messianic. Then the city and temple or sanctuary would be destroyed by the people of the coming prince. It's unclear whether the demise to come quickly like a flood refers to the prince or to the city and sanctuary, but it could be both, and a similar expression was used in Isaiah 59:19. And it's the people of the prince who do the destruction, not the prince himself. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple took place in 70 AD, which is 37 or 38 years after Jesus' ascension. It came at the hands of the Roman general Titus, whose soldiers burned the temple and then took it apart piece by piece to get the melted gold. This is what Jesus spoke of in Matthew 24:2. Now look at 27. The he points to the nearest person mentioned before that, called linguistically the antecedent, which was the one who would destroy the temple. But Titus didn't desecrate the temple or enforce any covenant. Some claim that he is Jesus who destroyed the temple and ended sacrifices in the middle of Passover week. Yet not only does this theory make the 70th week a week of days rather than years like the first 69 were, Jesus didn't make any covenant with a 7-year limit. In fact, the new covenant was not enacted until his death, which would be the start rather than the midpoint. And the temple system kept going until 70 AD, so it wasn't ended at that point. Another theory claims that Jesus' public ministry was ended after 3.5 years from his baptism, but not only is it impossible to prove that it lasted that precise length of time, in my opinion it was closer to 2 years, but once again, Jesus made no 7-year covenant when he was baptized by John either. But what does fit, since we've gone over the things that don't, is a yet future fulfillment where someone in the manner of both Antiochus Epiphanes and Titus will come and do all these things. This also blends well with Matthew 24, 15, and 16, where the people of Judea are to run when they see what happens to the temple, which is the abomination, which is putting what Antiochus did, is what I've tried to portray here, is a statue of Zeus in the temple to defile it. And then, of course, Antiochus also sacrificed a pig on the altar. So we can look for something very similar to this in the future. And in Revelation does say that the beast will erect a statue in the temple compound in some sort or manner, and it will be seen by the Jews, because of their memory of this event, as the abomination of desolation. That's why it must be literal. And Revelation 12, 13 to 15 is where Israel is taken to safety for 3.5 years. So this is all tying together with prophecies of the end times in the New Testament. So here's the gist of it. 483 years from the command to rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah is put to death. Then armies under the Roman general Titus destroy Jerusalem and the temple, 70 AD. After that, according to this sequence, war and disasters continue until the end. So that's after 70 AD. We have war and disasters. Then, at the end, the beast will confirm a treaty with many for the final 7 years. Midway through the 7, he will end temple sacrifice and desecrate it in a manner such as this you see here, and the end decreed upon him will come. This is the sequence, not necessarily the timing, but the sequence. And that helps guide us through Revelation. Now, we can finally move on to chapter 10, and yet another prophetic vision. Notice that in verse 3 that Daniel had given up meat and wine for 3 weeks, which means the vegetarian diet he was on when he first came to Babylon was not his lifelong habit. He was shown a vision of a glowing being in white linen resembling John's description of Jesus in Revelation, but the context indicates this is an angel rather than Jesus himself. And notice in verse 7, or actually verse 12, that God came to him because he had humbled himself and sought understanding. We often miss out on God's will for our lives because we won't do either or both of those things. But who is the prince of the kingdom of Persia in verse 13? There was even a video game once called Prince of Persia. This is undoubtedly where they got the term, but this is not a good prince. To delay a heavenly angel requires another supernatural being, so we can deduce that the Prince of Persia was a fallen angel that ruled behind the human powers of the land. Those are the powers that be behind the powers that be, to use a New Testament statement. And its power was such that the archangel Michael had to come and help. And looking down in verse 15, after giving Daniel the strength to even listen to the message, notice again in verse 20 that this angel wasn't looking forward to the return trip, which somehow would involve also the being ruling over Greece. So then he knew he would have to fight 2 of them on the way back. So there's things going on we have no idea about, except for little glimpses like these. And then verse 21 mentions a dependable book, which is a likely reference to a book of prophetic decrees in heaven, given the context. And the angel or prince Michael is said to be your prince, with you, your being plural. Saying to Daniel, your plural prince. This refers to Daniel's people Israel, but this does not mean Michael is the Messiah, as some false religions teach. And anybody who teaches that Michael is the Messiah is in a false religion, no matter what else they say, if they push this idea. The angel's words about this continue into chapter 11, which really should begin at verse 2. This is why there's a subheader there in the Net Bible. In hindsight, we know this is passed to us today, and it begins with what would happen in Persia's near future to the time of Daniel. 3 Persian kings would arise, and then a 4th who stirs up trouble against Greece, Alexander, most likely. And yet another king would arise, and by description we can identify him as Alexander the Great. This is the eventual king that he would be against. And this is where we get more detail about all that, and it goes on for quite a while in this chapter, so I will just try to summarize so you can follow along as you want. These are the 4 generals of Alexander. Ptolemy I was the king of the south. The daughter was actually the granddaughter, Berenice, who was given in marriage to Antiochus II in a doomed plan to achieve political gains by intrigue and deception. After various raids and generations, this king of the south, by that time, was Ptolemy IV, and then after him came Ptolemy V. Why they had to keep using those names? Well, they had to do a lot of times with titles rather than names, but anyway, the king of the north was Antiochus III, who, as prophesied, was utterly defeated in 217 BC. The details fit historical record, as with the Ptolemies, right up to the contemptible person who was Antiochus Epiphanes. It is he who is believed to have engineered the murder of a prince of the covenant, who was called Onias III, the high priest at the time in Israel. The first chapter of the apocryphal book, First Maccabees, details his Antiochus plundering of the temple and other acts of savagery. So you can read that if you want more details of that, because it is mostly the value of, I think, of the apocryphal books is more historical. But again, though these things were indeed fulfilled in the past, we can't dogmatically state that no future fulfillments remain. But neither can we presume that these alliances and military campaigns will be repeated in the future. And of all the details of the remaining prophecies given in Revelation, there is no mention of the kings of the north and south and details that would connect them to future events. So though a future fulfillment is possible, it seems unlikely, but starting in verse 36, let's skip all the way down to there, we read of the king who exalts himself, who has no regard for the gods of his ancestors or for the desire of women. This means a god desired by women, not that the Antichrist would be a homosexual or anything like that. People take that wrong. It's the context and the language tell you that this is a god or goddess desired by women, and this contemptible person will have no regard for any gods. So neither will this be a Muslim, since by definition he would have to honor their god. But he honors none of them. Instead, he will honor, it is called a god of fortresses, which some take as being simply materialistic, a god of success, in whose name he attacks other fortresses. That is to say, he's going around looting and acquiring things out of greed, and he will, as he goes along, gives out his conquered lands as prizes to his friends, which aren't really friends, they're more sycophants and people who just have knuckled under. We might still tie him in with the preceding discussion of Antiochus Epiphanes and the kings of the north and south, but look at verse 40. We see the phrase, at the time of the end. So there's a shift in fulfillment here, and new details to follow have no historical precedent. A king of the north will attack this future king, and the attack is then joined by a king of the south with a huge multifaceted force. But he still manages to attack, he being the beast, basically, still managed to attack the land of Israel, that the people now occupying the country of Jordan will escape the assault. That's by description. We know where those people are, where the people groups are, and that's the area of Jordan. They will escape the assault on that area. Egypt and the countries on the south side of the Mediterranean will fall, but this beast will hear alarming reports from the east and north, so he'll go off in a rage. But as he camps between the Mediterranean and Dead Seas, that's what commentators believe this refers to, he will come to his end. Though the beast will begin with the appearance of peace per chapter 8, verse 25 here, and Revelation 6:2, the white horse, we've seen that war will rage for most of the beast's short reign. Now, chapter 12 starts with, at that time, and again, Michael is mentioned as the prince watching over Israel. This is where we see the phrase Jesus used, a time of distress such has not happened from the beginning of nations until then. He was quoting Daniel when he said that. And there has been much terrible suffering in the world since 70 AD, such that the fall of Jerusalem at that time cannot have been the ultimate fulfillment of the prophecy. But because of this overlap and duality, teachers of Bible prophecy must exercise restraint and caution in looking for modern fulfillments. All we can be sure of is that those things without any historical match will certainly take place. And what it tells us here is that Daniel's people, at least the ones whose names are in the book, will escape. We know that whoever sees the abomination of desolation and runs will be kept safe during the Great Tribulation, which is the final 3.5 years. So those are the ones written in the book. Then we see the first clear Old Testament statement about eternity. Some will arise to experience everlasting life, but others to experience everlasting contempt. The contrast is not between existence and non-existence, or long and short existence, since both are everlasting. But instead, the contrast is between honor and shame. Both are eternal, and both are conscious. And as some commentators have pointed out, and I pointed out in other lessons, God himself is described in the same aionion word in Greek, and the equivalent in Hebrew, which is very similar sound. If God's existence is described in that term, then it cannot mean a limited duration. Or at least we must acknowledge that it can mean an unlimited duration. So again, whenever it's contrasted with life, the duration of suffering or punishment must also be just as long, which is eternal. Now, if we go down to verse 4, Daniel is told again to seal the prophecy, but in this case, he's to seal it until the time of the end. This is why Revelation, which means the opposite, means to reveal or unveil, is a book for the time of the end, not the past. But what does it mean that people will run around and increase knowledge? And by the way, what I mean by not the past is that Revelation certainly is still future to us, but it has been revealed, is the point. Not that its fulfillment is past, but its revealing was past. It was done in 95 AD. But anyway, this is why Revelation, which means the opposite, is a book of the time of the end, not the past. But what does it mean that the people will run around and increase knowledge? The two together suggest a desperate thirst for understanding, as people have done in recent years for Bible prophecy, though it could also be a clue about modern life, running around in vast increases of knowledge. All we know is that the reign of the beast is for a mere 3.5 years. That's what a concrete thing we can take from that. We should also take comfort in knowing that not even Daniel could figure this out, but we aren't to know the timing until the fulfillment begins. The angel repeats that there will be 3.5 years from the abomination of desolation and the end of the tribulation. So that's a time marker for anyone left behind, is that to experience this, is that they know when they see this abomination, this idol in the temple, that there's 3.5 years to go. But then the angel adds that there's a special blessing for whoever waits patiently for another 45 days after that. I was unable to find any consistent explanations for the extra days, though some think it might be a time of purification or reconstruction between Jesus' defeat of the beast and his entering Jerusalem. And as the New Testament says, even angels long to look into these things. As I mentioned before about the prophets, nobody saw this coming, nobody understood it. And since this is a prophecy of the end times, then we probably aren't going to fully understand it either. The only people who will are the people who experience it. And that's how Bible prophecy goes, and we're happy that this is the end of Daniel's short book because it was so jam-packed. It took an hour to go over, and what you could spend a year to go over if you went over all the details. But I'll leave that to you, and the links in the description, because my main purpose in these lessons is to give the gist of things and to get at least a basic, accurate understanding of what the books are about and what some puzzling statements mean along the way. And that's it for our study of Daniel.